So, good evening, everyone. I should think we are streaming now. And yeah, it's just 6 minutes after 7 here in Poland. And hello to everyone, wherever you are: US, Canada, Australia, America. Yeah, all sorts of places. So, guys, thanks for joining me. I see we've got Indri, Francis Boole, Just Janice, Sergeant Grinch, Dr. Mutaman, Philip. So, welcome, everyone. Uh, yeah, so I'm still not well. So, forgive me if I cough or so on during the talk. Uh, Yeah, so guys, thanks all for being here. Let's dive into this. Uh, so of course, today we're talking about Martin Luther. We're going through the second part of my talk on Martin Luther's attitude towards the Jews. Now, it is not an exaggeration, it is not a stretch to state that Martin Luther, his ideology, his theology, aligns very well with Mohammed, aligns very well with Hitler. In fact, it heavily influenced Adolf Hitler. So, which I find very curious because many supposed Christians, Catholics, Protestants, were have and do make comments to me and talk about, well, Martin Luther was right, and yes, they're all right. So I find it very strange when Christians believe that Adolf Hitler was morally correct, that Adolf Hitler was 100% correct and justified. So I was not aware that Christians take their moral example from Muhammad and from Hitler, but apparently these Christians do. So they would regard Hitler as a Christian example, which I would then have to question your Christian credentials. But that now, of course, the lying and the hatred, the absolute hatred, was learned from Martin Luther. Now, of course, I've seen numerous statements on YouTube and such where from theologians to various YouTube people will say things like, well, Martin Luther was a little out of line about the Jews, that's terrible, but we're going to go deeper and down this rabbit hole today, and you're going to discover it's a lot worse than they're trying to downplay it, they're trying to whitewash it, they're trying to minimize it. They're simply not demonstrating just how vicious this man was, how violent he was. Now, of course, we know why these Christians would also perhaps think that Hitler was justified because Hitler himself never killed any Jews. He didn't personally go out and slaughter anyone. He incited the violence. He ordered the violence. Well, Martin Luther was in very much the same camp. While he personally was not known to have gone and killed anyone himself, he did recommend that people die. So I guess that makes it okay. He was, everyone else was just following orders. So yeah, so excuse my frustration with this, but Christians who tell me that Hitler was correct and that Muhammad was correct and that hatred is correct, I am going to seriously question your Christian credentials. Okay, so let's have a look. I want to go to something. I had a discussion with someone, and I was trying to use basic logic, and they were disputing basic English, which I found really interesting. But I'll get into the details in the future another time. But let's have a look at some of Martin Luther's attitudes to give you some additional context. Welcome, D. Mieleman, Kush XD, Artsy Fartsy, always good to see you. Logan Silvermore, very welcome. Okay, so now Martin Luther was a hypocrite, and I hope I've made this clear. I hope that I've demonstrated sufficiently, and I'm going through Martin Luther's works. I'm starting to understand the search function. I'm starting to get the hang of the language in the translations that I have. So Martin Luther says, Scripture alone ought to be read without commentaries. So you must only read Scripture. Do not read commentaries. Do not go to the early church fathers. Don't go to any theologians prior. Only read the Scripture. That's what he's saying. You are right about Jerome. Now he's talking here about Melanchthon. He's partner in crime, Melanchthon. You were right about Jerome, Origen, Thomas, and their ilk. They wrote commentaries in which they passed on what was their own ideas rather than what was Paul's or Christ's. So now he's accusing of the early church fathers prior to him of writing their own theology and not correctly interpreting scripture. Now, of course, let's have a look at what Martin Luther himself says, because the man is a hypocrite and he contradicts himself constantly. He says, if your papist, your Catholic, wants to make so much fuss about the word sola, alone, tell him this: Dr. Martin Luther will have it so. and says that a papist and an ass are the same thing. Sic volo, sic jubeo, sic pro ratione voluntas. In other words, Martin Luther says, so I wish, so I command, let my will stand in place of reason. So in other words, Martin Luther has told you, Martin Luther has spoken. You do not listen to anyone prior to me. Now, he actually does say this later on. I'll get to all of this as we go through this Martin Luther series. But he says, so I wish, so I command, my will. Now remember that Allah is will. Yahweh, the Christian God, is Logos. Jesus is the Logos. Will is satanic. Will is Satan. And Martin Luther's philosophy of nominalism leads to will. I will come back to nominalism. I will do it again, and I will explain that in detail and exactly and precisely why Martin Luther's philosophy undermined Christianity. But he says, let my will stand in place of reason. As we know, Martin Luther threw reason out the window, right? So he says, we are not going to be the pupils and disciples of the papists, but their masters and judges. And he says, we too are going to brag and be proud with these blockheads. And as St. Paul boasts over against these mad raving saints, so I shall boast over and against these asses of mine. Are they doctors? So am I. Are they learned? So am I. Are they preachers? So am I. Are they theologians? So am I. Are they debaters? So am I. Are they philosophers? So am I. Are they dialecticians? So am I. Are they lecturers? So am I. Do they write books? So do I. So I wish, so I command. Let my will stand in place of reason. So yeah, obviously very humble man. I'm just, it's incredible how humble he is. Let's have a look more. And he says here, now, everyone says, well, you know, the Catholic Church is wrong about, you know, because like it says that it's scripture alone. It is scripture alone, and that's in the Bible. And it's like everyone knows it's like because it's biblical. Because Martin Luther, you know, it's all. Well, let's have a look at what Martin Luther says here. Here in Romans 3:28, I know very well that the word solum is not in the Greek or Latin text. The papists, the Catholics, did not have to teach me that. It is a fact that these four letters, sola, are not there. And these blockheads stare at them like cows at a new gate. At the same time, the Catholics do not see that the word sola conveys the sense of the text. Yes, it's not literally in the text. No, it is not in the original Greek. No, it's not in the original Hebrew. No, it is not written into the Bible, but you see it belongs there because I, Martin Luther, will have it so. So I wish, so I command, and my will must stand in place of reason. In other words, F you, my name is Martin Luther, and this is what I want. Do you understand? This is the personality that we are dealing with in Martin Luther. So he says, at the same time, they do not see that it conveys the sense of the text. It belongs there if the translation is to be clear and vigorous. Because the voices in Martin Luther's head told him it belongs there. So he was not interested in what was literally in the Bible. He was interested in what he wanted to be in the Bible because, yeah, me, exactly, Just Janice. So, yeah, so remember, Thaddeus did state in his talk that he disagrees with me factually. I would love to see what he's factually disagreed with here. But let's continue. Let this be the answer to your first question, and please give these asses no other and no further answer to their useless braying about the word sola than simply this. Luther will have it so, and says that he is a doctor above all the doctors of the whole papacy. It shall stay at that. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this today, but Martin Luther states that he is a greater theologian than even St. Paul. He's a greater theologian than anyone before him. He's a greater theologian than every single church father. And he is a doctor. Now, the doctors of the papacy would be the early church fathers. Understand that. He is greater than Augustine. He's greater than Jerome. He's greater than Origen. He's greater than everyone before him. So do understand. You see, now, I shall hold them in contempt, right? And he says, to you and our people, I shall show why I chose to use the word sola. Though in Romans 3:28, it was not sola, right? So it doesn't exist. He is admitting it does not exist in the Bible. He made it up himself because Martin Luther said so. That's that simple. There you go. This is from Martin Luther's works. That's Martin Luther's own words, his own writing. Um, yeah. So anyway, so just make a note of the attitude we're dealing with. Of course, Martin Luther wrote this book again, as well this paper, against the robbing and murdering hordes of peasants. You see, so that's why he had to justify the murder of the peasants. I mean, 100,000 peasants were killed because of Martin Luther inciting violence against them, but that's okay because it's Martin Luther, isn't it? Now, again, before we get into this thing, he really thought a whole lot of himself. He did. He did. So now, this is something I read recently by Armas Holmio. He's written a number of little apologetics books. Martin Luther, friend or foe of the Jews. Well, when you read it, let's just say that the stuff that I've been telling you about Martin Luther's view on the Jews just doesn't quite make its way into this book. I have no idea why. He probably just didn't get that far. But let's just say it overlooked, shall we say, important facts. And this tells me that a lot of the apologia written in defense of Martin Luther just kind of deliberately seems to ignore the fact that the man was on the same page as Hitler and Mohammed. So, yeah, but anyway, let's get into the facts of the story. Let's get into this again. This is where we ended off last time. Remember, the paper is listed down below in the comment in the description. And thank God Martin Luther was born, because without him, no one would know how to interpret scripture. Actually, you know what? Let me get something here. Let me get to this. So hold on. Let me just get something here. Martin Luther did state, "I acknowledge no fixed rules for the interpretation of the Word of God." Again, something to discuss at length another time, but Martin Luther says there is no fixed set of rules for the interpretation of the Word of God. In other words, I, Martin Luther, will make this up as I go. Right? And he says, I mean, and someone yesterday was disputing with me about the meaning of this. They couldn't get this. Every Christian is his own pope and own church. Those are the words of Martin Luther. Praise be to Allah. Right? Every Christian is his own pope and own church. What is the implication if you are your own private, personal church and religious authority? Where does that leave Christianity? Yeah. Okay, but let's move on from that point. So remember, Martin Luther had written a scathing rebuke of the princes for oppressing the peasants. This should be part of a playlist. I should have a Luther playlist, a Martin Luther playlist, Roxy. So, yeah. Okay, now the peasants demanded the princes offer them some reduction of taxes and housing rent, fishing privileges and the like. So he'd written a rebuke of the princes for their oppression of the peasants. When the peasants revolted, Martin Luther abandoned the peasants, he betrayed them, and he instructed everyone, including the princes, to murder the peasants, which they did. Something like 100,000 peasants were killed. So Luther stood behind the aggressive princes and urged them to crush the peasants' rebellion. He described the peasants as follows: "A great fire that burns and consumes the land. Remember that nothing can be more poisonous, harmful, or devilish than a rebel." He painted them as rebels. Right? It is just it's a mad dog that must be killed. If you would not attack and kill the rebel first, he will attack you and the whole country with you. So he demonized these peasants who were oppressed. And of course, the Thuringian peasants' army was destroyed in the battle near Frankenhausen. 6,000 peasants were slaughtered by their oppressors. During the peasants' revolt, about 100,000 farmers were killed. All right? So now we know about that. So he was willing to demonize people and have them killed. Right, so let's continue from here. White Rose, welcome. Mr. Evac says, unrelated, how do you feel over the Christ is King fiasco? Obviously, there would be something that's abusing. I mean, look, people are going to try and use anything. They'll twist anything. If you said good morning, some stupid feminist would use it as you being misogynist and trying to hit on her and get you sued and then thrown in jail for that. So yeah, you can take anything and you can twist it. It's that simple. So, in 1536, Martin Luther refused to meet with Joseph or Joseph of Rosheim, the advocate of the Jewish communities in the Holy Roman Empire and Poland, to discuss help in cancellation of the decree regarding the expulsion of the Jews from Saxony. Luther supported and prompted the expulsion. So Luther's anti-Jewish assertions and activities are not the result of his advanced age, because Martin Luther already did similar things in his much earlier years. So the common excuse is that Martin Luther was getting old and cranky, and therefore he did it. Well, no, when he was younger, he was already writing very hateful things and inciting violence, right? So now this is written here. This is from Martin Luther. This is a translation from the German. I have heard and read many stories about the Jews and agree with them, and agree with Christ's judgment on them. For example, how they poison the wells, how they secretly murder, how they steal children, as mentioned above. A Jew sent a pot full of blood to another Jew through a Christian, and a dead Jew was found in the barrel of wine when it was drained dry, and they have done many such things. They often burn and brand the children they steal, as mentioned earlier. Jews know very well that they do all these things, but everything corresponds with Christ's judgment of them as poisonous, bitter, vengeful, cunning snakes, crafty murderers, and children of the devil who secretly harm and injure others because they cannot do so openly. That is why I would like them not to be among us, as they are not Christians. The Turks and other non-Christians do not suffer such things from them, and we Christians suffer nothing from them either, for a Christian should not have a hostile, bitter enemy closer than the devil, such as a Jew. We do many good deeds for them and suffer much at the hand of these wicked devil's children and snakes. So yeah, so that's why Martin Luther didn't want the Jews near him, because they will drain your blood and drink it, and they will steal your children and eat them and brand your kids. And so yeah, so these good Christians who side with Hitler, they obviously are taking Luther verbatim here, that Jesus apparently hated the Jews too. The fact that Jesus was a Jew, but of course Martin Luther has an excuse in place for that as well. You see, I was referring to the Jews from Jesus' time and before Jesus. After that, the Jews are all devils, snakes, evil demons, and they'll eat you and steal your kids and murder you in your sleep. So now, okay. Now, of course, some people try to say, well, it was the death of his 13-year-old daughter, Magdalena, in 1542 that caused him to lose his mind, right? All fine and well, but maybe that's not an excuse. So Martin Luther does write here. He says that the Jews' synagogues be burned with fire. So he wants the Jews' synagogues to be, yeah, that's not being old and cranky, that's being demonic. Yes, that's Martin Luther. The man was evil. Really. Right? So that their synagogues be burned with fire, and whoever can should throw sulfur and pitch, and whoever can also announce hellish fire, do whatever is good. So in other words, set fire to their synagogues. He also calls set fire to their homes, burn their possessions, throw them out, enslave them, make them work, right? This is what Martin Luther writes. So he says, and he calls this good, because Jesus would want this. Understand, Martin Luther is a great theologian, and Jesus would want you to burn the Jews' synagogues, burn their houses, burn their books, take their possessions, enslave them, make them work, throw them out, dispossess them. That is the Christian thing to do. That is Christ-like. That's what Martin Luther told us, and Luther cannot be wrong. So, and Hitler did exactly that. Mohammed did that. So therefore, these Christians understand how this works. So that God, in earnest, and the whole world might see an example of this, since we have long tolerated such a house in which the Jews have insulted God, our loving Creator and Father, with their filth, unwittingly, now we should give them their due punishment. Yeah, we need to make jihad on these people for what they've done. Yeah, Christ told us to hate our enemies, exactly White Rose, and Martin Luther is simply acting on hate thy enemy. Destroy their homes, burn their possessions. That's Martin Luther. So Luther emphasized God's wrath against the Jewish people for rejecting Jesus as a Messiah and denying Christianity. Therefore, Jews must be oppressed, humbled, and suffer unless they accept Islam. So you must make jihad on people, and they must pay the jizya in suffering and humiliation unless they accept Islam. Does that sound kind of familiar? Do we know of a guy called Mo that maybe had the same sort of a deal for Jews and Christians back in the day? Sound kind of familiar? Because it sounds familiar to me. Am I wrong in making that assertion? Am I wrong in making that connection? Please let me know if I'm simply making this up. Now, he says here, nevertheless, scholars ignore the fact, and this is Lutheran scholars, that the Bible also includes many positive statements concerning the Israelites and Jews and their future. Luther therefore had a choice to emphasize the negative sayings or emphasize the positive. Martin Luther chose to emphasize the negative. Martin Luther chose to do jihad on the Jews. And they say here, okay, he continued the historical Christian theology that attributes all the positive sayings in the Bible to the Christians. So in other words, Martin Luther stated that everything that is good, that is taken from the Bible, is from Christians. Only Christians said good things in the Bible. There is nothing in the Bible that comes from Jews that is good. It is all evil. Sola jihad, exactly, Dr. Mato. So the true Israel, so the Christians are the true Israel, and all the negative sayings he attributes to the Talmudic Jews. Now, I'm pretty sure that Christians today still quote the Old Testament, and this is why within the Protestant side of things, they have gotten rid. This is one of the reasons that Martin Luther's followers eventually got rid of the Deuterocanon, which is why I call it the Apocrypha, which was an insult to the books of the Bible. Remember, these were books of the Bible that had been established for 1,500 years prior to Martin Luther. Then he insulted them, called them the Apocrypha. In other words, fake news, and got them kicked out of the Bible eventually. Martin Luther insulted the Bible on a routine basis. I know it's supposedly sola scriptura, the Bible is sacred, the Bible's holy, you can't say anything bad. Martin Luther took a fat dump on the Bible in his language. And I will get to that as well. I have discussed it in the past. I will discuss again in the future. So yeah, but I'm pretty sure Christians today quote the Old Testament and find good things in it. And of course, all of Jesus' followers were Jews. So these horrendous assertions by Luther go far beyond the anti-Jewish statements known from any Christian writings before him, or several of Luther's contemporary theologians and reformers. So yeah, so Martin Luther took hatred of Jews to a new level. Since Luther himself condemned such evil stances towards Jews in the earlier stage of his career as a reformer, he can hardly be excused as being unaware of the harm of his language, of the injustice and the horrible consequences. He has seen these consequences, yet he continued in the same tradition and amped it up to 11. So on the contrary, if he had held to his own standards, Luther would have had to condemn himself. Pope bad, Catholic bad, Church bad because hate Jews. Martin Luther, now calling for the murder of Jews, now calling for the enslavement of Jews, now calling for the destruction of their property. Martin Luther, good guy. So equivalent to Mohammed, equivalent to Adolf Hitler, but Martin Luther's the good guy. So yeah, do you understand the issue that I have when interpreting this, when reading this? And so, for instance, for example, we can take his own word on the Catholics and paraphrase them to be about himself. Luther against Luther. I should rather have turned into a pig than become Christian like Luther. He treats the Jews as if they were dogs and not human beings. So he had stated this, because the Catholics said this. Well, the way the Catholics supposedly treated the Jews, therefore the Jews would say that in response to the Catholics. Now that Martin Luther was even worse, these words showed what a hypocrite he himself was. Holmio also insists that, and that's the same fool here, this is this idiot here, Armas Holmio. So he's referring now to the words in this book. This guy's such a fool. So Holmio, that's him here. Something went beep, so I'm sure something happened, not sure what that was. So, Holmio also asserts that even if Luther had experienced some unpleasantness at the hands of some individual Jew, it would have been contrary to Martin Luther's honest and generous nature to punish the whole nation because of it, which is what we would call a lie. Okay, so we would call this man a liar. If he's not lying, well, then he's deeply misinformed, but I suspect the guy knows better, and he's just simply misinforming you, right? So yeah, so Holmio says that this would have been contrary to the honest and generous nature. So it is hard to understand the statement, especially in light of Luther's repeated attacks on all the Jews and all the Turks and the Papists, the Catholics, as undifferentiated groups, and after his assertion regarding the German peasants in 1525. Now look, there is a lot, and I tell you, there is a lot of really bad, extremely bad history, really bad, dishonest apologia for Luther. Okay, written by guys who are like, I'm a priest, I'm at the church, and I give services twice a week, and they're talking absolute trash. You get people with PhDs writing absolute trash. Okay, so let me see. Yeah, Mikem, yeah, Martin Luther, you're all rotten, I'm marvelous. Yeah, and Lutherans will declare that Luther's personal beliefs have nothing to do with them. That is another falsehood. Yes, that is another falsehood. All of these ideas come from Martin Luther. you'd be amazed that as Protestants, we are raised in Martin Luther's tradition. That whole worldview is unconsciously inculcated. It's part and parcel of the tradition that derives from Martin Luther. It's scary. Okay, so by the way, you can find this book in my archive link in the description box. Okay, just look for Holmio. Just look for this guy's surname, or Armas. Okay, continuing. So he says here, where did Holmio find this honest and generous nature of Luther? The kill the peasants Luther. So then he says, here's the next excuse. Was Luther indeed a son of his time, a man of his time? Like, you can't blame Mohammed for wanting to murder everybody and killing people and shagging a child, because he was a man of his time. It was normal back then. In fact, that was normal Christianity, to murder Jews all the time. It was normal Christianity, because he's a man of his time. He was practicing Christianity as understood then. And, so we can't, how can we judge murder? Because that was Christianity of the day, Yeah. All those eternal moral principles. No, can't have that. Because hypocrisy. So, hatred of the Jews was not new to 16th century Germany. However, it never reached such a climax as in Martin Luther's case. Luther had a choice. He could take a different direction, as he himself had offered in That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew, the book that he wrote. But of course, he chose to go the route of hatred. So a couple of questions. So Momo couldn't help being the barbaric desert bandit he was. Yeah, but he's a great example, the perfect example for mankind. So Polo Down says, love these videos of Martin Luther. Thank you very much. Yeah, so please tell people about them. Do speak about them. Share them. I'd appreciate that. We need to get this out there, because everyone's going to say, well, Lloyd, you're cherry picking only the nasty parts. Well, you see, the PhDs and the priests who have the little collars and go to church, and we're good Baptists here. Welcome to the Baptist 93rd Church of 4th Street. Oh, darn it. Am I doing that again? Yeah, my camera keeps doing this to me. Let me just reset my camera. Those Baptist priests and those Anglican priests and those everyone else priests are simply overlooking these basic facts about Luther. They are, shall we say, whitewashing the story and forgetting to add these very important details that change the picture and make Martin Luther like an early Hitler. So yeah, I think that's important. If Martin Luther had a lot in common with Adolf Hitler or Mohammed, I think we need to know. So now there's a guy called Reuchlin. Okay, Reuchlin's up here. He says, the great humanist, philosopher, and Hebraist, Johannes Reuchlin. Okay, Goethe defines as a marvel of his time. Great. So Reuchlin stands totally in opposition to that of Martin Luther, who suggests burning Jewish synagogues, schools, prayer books, and Talmuds to ashes. Now remember, once you start burning people's properties, possessions, once you start burning their schools, once you start, the KKK did that. Don't forget, the KKK did that, and I guess that makes the KKK equivalent to Martin Luther, because they might have gotten their information from Luther, for that matter. They might just be following Martin Luther's advice. That said, once you start burning people's things, people might take offense at that, right? And that might lead to violence, and then of course you end up with violence on your hands, and people then get very, very hurt. So Martin Luther was aware of the consequences, because this wasn't the first time that such things had happened. He was well aware of it. So of course Jews did get killed. Jews did get murdered. Jews were hurt. So yeah, he was advocating for things that would obviously lead to escalation of violence. So Luther would have preferred that the books of Esther and 2 Maccabees had never existed at all. So now, Sola Scriptura, the Bible is sacred. Now, according to Martin Luther, the Bible, oh my God, the Bible is sacred, except that book is crap. Oh, that's a horrible book, and get rid of that stupid book. No, that book in the Bible, oh God, these have been in the Bible for 1,500 years? Oh my God, what were these Christians thinking? These are crappy books. We got to throw them out. Now, here's the thing. Maybe Martin Luther didn't personally throw them out of the Bible. That would have been too much sacrilege, probably would have caused too much of an uproar, but they were eventually removed by his followers. And Martin Luther did insult them, demean them, demote them, and move them to another part of the Bible. So let's have a look at this Esther and Maccabees. Okay, so let's have a look at this. So the Apocrypha, Esther and 2 Maccabees. And he says here, Esther, which despite their inclusion of it in the canon, deserves more than all the rest in my judgment to be regarded as non-canonical. That's Martin Luther's own words, right? And now, Maimonides, the Jewish commentator, very famous man, said Esther was next to the law of Moses in importance. So because it's important to the Jews, he obviously wanted it gone. So also Martin Luther starts to heavily criticize the Jewish interpretation of the Bible. And so basically, because he hated the Jews, he had to reinterpret the Bible. He had to completely reinterpret it because the Jews had to be wrong. Martin Luther had to do the opposite of what the Jews said. And because he also hated Catholics, because he absolutely hated the Pope, which is a Christian virtue, don't forget. Calling for murder is a Christian virtue. Calling for hatred is not a Muslim virtue at all. It's not like what Hitler did. Not at all. Not at all. It's Christian. Jesus would have wanted that. And Martin Luther was following the Bible and Jesus accurately, 100%. Don't say anything wrong. So, of course, he had to then change the interpretations that the Catholics were using because his was a hermeneutics of hate, right? So he says, Luther put it on a list with 2 Maccabees for books that Judaized too much and contain much pagan naughtiness. That's a very polite translation. And it is proper that this second book should be thrown out of the Bible, even though it contains some good things, right? And he says, and Luther omitted 3 and 4 Maccabees as well as 3 and 4 Esdras. But he also cut out 1 and 2 Esdras because they contain nothing that one could not find better in Aesop's fables. So books that had been part of the Bible for 1,000 years. Yeah, Joel Thomas, these translations of Martin Luther's are, shall we say, sanitized. So he says here, I take the book of Tobit to be a comedy concerning women. I am so great an enemy to the second book of Maccabees and to Esther that I wish they had not come to us at all. So he's acknowledging that these books have been part of the Bible for centuries, for 2,000 years. But Martin Luther says, because I, Martin Luther, wish it so, this crap's got to be thrown out of the Bible, and eventually it was. So it's not just James. Everyone goes, well, he didn't like James, didn't like Revelation. No, Martin Luther hated about 30% of the Bible. Because don't forget, the Bible is holy, the Bible is perfect, sola scriptura, except those books are shit. Excuse my French, but that's effectively Martin Luther's attitude. Okay? So Martin Luther does say here, I am Isaiah. And Martin Luther says, be it spoken with humility. I say with humility, as Martin Luther, I say humbly, that I am Isaiah. To the advancement of God's honor, whose work alone it is, and to spite the devil. Yeah. Wonderful stuff. Great, Martin. Good stuff. Good moves. Okay, so let's continue here. He says here, ich bin dem Buch Makkabäer und Esther so feind, dass ich wollte, sie wären gar nicht vorhanden. Denn sie judenzen zu sehr und haben viel heidnisches Unart. Yeah? Let's have a look let's translate heidnisches Unart. Let's see what that translates as. This is assuming that we're getting the correct German. Okay, I'm just going to look this up quickly. Heidnisches Unart. Pagan customs. Okay, so now we've got pagan customs, pagan naughtiness. I wonder if you look at the original German, I wonder if it actually says that. So it is worth mentioning that generations of biblical scholars and theologians followed Luther's antagonism towards the canonical books of Esther and loaded on it their own anti-Jewish agenda. So Martin Luther hated Jews. Martin Luther hated the Pope. Martin Luther hated Catholics. Do you think that would influence his interpretation of the Bible, that he would make changes and alterations purely to be anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish? So ponder that for a moment. Yes, that book that was written by some random Jew. Yes, some Jew wrote that, exactly. So let me see, Martin Luther was a prototype Grand Dragon. Yes, he was. You can't judge murder if you weren't murdered yourself. Only Love says, is it true that Martin Luther also moved the New Testament books to the back of the New Testament that he didn't like? Yes, that is true. That is true. He did, as a way of indicating that these books need to go. So let me see. Thank you. So let's see. What am I missing, if anything? These books are so good to read. I have to do this the last time. Beautiful. Yeah. The Dead Sea Scrolls debunked Luther, showing that Deuterocanon books were accepted by some Jews and written. Well, here's the thing. Martin Luther wasn't. So Only Love says the Dead Sea Scrolls debunked Luther. Let me just bring this comment up. Okay. So Joel Tom says the dude was definitely most on something. Yep, for sure. So the Dead Sea Scrolls debunked Luther, showing that Deuterocanon books were accepted by the Jews and written in the Hebrew languages too. Now, this is important for the simple reason that Martin Luther refused to accept books that were not available in the original Hebrew. Now, of course, I can go to quotes of Martin Luther where he states, I completely disagree with these rabbis. I completely disagree with these Hebrew translators, these Jewish translators. I completely disagree with how they interpret the Bible. But when he wanted to attack the Catholics, he's like, those books are only in Greek. They're not in Hebrew. We got to toss them out. I only accept. I am Martin Luther. I'm Isaiah. I'm very humble. I'm incredibly humble. Martin Luther also does later on say he's greater than Paul. Okay. But those books are not in Hebrew, so they have to go. They need to be thrown out. Of course, then he was happy to go along with the Jews because then he could attack the Catholics. But in his hypocrisy also, of course, we discovered later that the Dead Sea Scrolls showed that some of these books are in Hebrew. They were originally in Hebrew. So Martin Luther was wrong. So therefore, by his own rules, he has to accept those books. Of course, he would not accept them because he's a hypocrite. So he blamed the Jews, stating that the violence stemming from the rebellion of the peasants in Germany came about because the participants were largely Jews who hate Christ. So now he attacks the peasant. He attacks the princes as oppressors of totalitarian oppressors of the peasants. The peasants rise up. He betrays the peasants. He supports the princes. Tells everyone to murder the peasants, and then he says the violence is because of the Jews. Those peasants were all Jews. So now he had nothing to do with that. Now they're all Jews. The Christians were fighting against Christians and Jews. Okay, thus Christians were fighting against Christians and Jews were blamed for it. Christians were fighting against Christians and he blamed the Jews for it. This absurdity was the logic of the humanist Erasmus, who praised France for being free of heretical Jews. So you've got, so Martin Luther claimed he's the prophet Isaiah, something like that. He claimed he is like Isaiah. Yeah, he claimed he is like Isaiah. He claimed he was a prophet. I mean, I'll cover all of these things in the future. I've done so in the past on other shows. So now we move to Erasmus briefly. Erasmus felt disgust at the Jews, but forgot that Jesus and his adherents were Jews. Zwingli, now, Huldrych Zwingli. Zwingli described the Jews as unappreciative, faithless, and erring, unbelieving Jews. Irrende. So irrende could also mean irrational, right? It's not a polite word. Ungläubige, unbelieving Juden, right? So Zwingli considered the rejection of Christ as the greatest sin of the Jews, who have suffered exile ever since as a divine punishment. Now, the terms usurers or wucherer and Jews became almost synonyms in medieval Europe. So the Jews became usurers, but that's actually a point that is related to the fact that Christians were not allowed to lend money at interest. This, of course, is allowed in the Bible. It's literally in the Bible that Jews are allowed to lend money with interest. And so, but Jews are blamed because now, so Christians weren't allowed, Jews were allowed, but then Jews are blamed for it, even though it's quite literally biblical, right? So now, Zwingli never repeated the common medieval Christian accusation against the Jews, such as well poisoning or ritual murder of Christians, right? He considered the present treatment of Jews by their authorities to be unjust, right? So now we talk about John Calvin. In his commentary on the book of Daniel in 1561, John Calvin declares, I have often spoken to many Jews, but never noticed a drop of piety, a grain of truth, or mental power with them, because according to John Calvin, Jews are stupid, right? In fact, I have never discovered any real common sense in any Jew. So here you've got the statement that reveals John Calvin's prejudice. Now, in his introduction to the French translation of the Bible by Olive Tan, Neuchâtel, 1535, John Calvin dedicated a special prologue to Jewish readers for a missionary purpose. Here he speaks respectfully about the people of the Sinai covenant who have the fear of the Lord. Now that sounds all very nice, except how does he mean that, right? So in Calvin's theology, including in this prologue, the Israelite or Judahite and the Jews of the Old Testament are identified with the Messianic Jews of the New Testament who followed Jesus, but not the contemporary Jews, because those aren't real Jews. You see, those are Khazars, and those are just not really Jews, but they come from Russia and blah, 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 blah. So even though he's saying nice things here, this is where this whole conspiracy theory that the Jews are not Jews and not the real Jews, and those are actually fake Jews that come from whatever, Ashkenazis and blah, 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 right? So even John Calvin, now here's the thing, these are highly, highly influential theologians. These are very powerful figures, and they spoke recklessly. Their words had powerful effect, and their words led to discrimination, hatred, and oppression and death. Simple. So Century Sin says, so I feel if Martin Luther had lived any longer, he would have started calling himself the true Messiah. I wouldn't say you're wrong. I would not say you're wrong, because I believe he kind of did. Effectively, he was. So he also hated Jesus, considering he called our Lord an adulterer. How dare he even call himself a Christian? Yes. Now, of course, that's going to be argued and discussed. Wow, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. That's Heavy Hand 3. Thank you very, very kindly for that. I really appreciate that support. So, yeah, is there anything that I can answer for you, Heavy Hand? Because I do appreciate that. Let me just bring that up. So, yeah, thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Heavy Hand. Okay, so Silly Khazar theories. Yes, the Jews made in China. Yeah. Random psychological question. Did Martin Luther suffer from syphilis? Apparently he did. According to one of the records I saw, apparently he did. That is apparently a valid conclusion to draw from his medical. The man was an extremely sick man. He was really sick. He suffered from a host of maladies. So he was a very, very sick man. So, yeah. Okay. Let's continue, because I want to try and finish this today if I can. In his commentaries, Calvin often attacks the Jewish biblical interpreters and calls them foolish, amongst other insults. So did Martin Luther. Thus, in his commentary on Genesis, he makes no less than 52 critical comments regarding Jews. And the Jews are very fond, in the sense of naive apparently, in feigning or pretending that God communicated his words with the earth or with angels. So the Jews pretend that God communicated with earth, right, or with angels. But it is well that their doggish wickedness is joined with so great blockish dullness that they may betray their foolishness even to children. Even children can see that Jews are stupid. God would not communicate his word with the earth or with angels. Therefore, Christians do very aptly affirm upon this testimony, that's the testimony of Calvin, that there are no persons in God, and that God calleth unto him no foreign person. I find that really weird. There are no persons in God, and that God calleth unto him no foreign person. Okay, here I'm not a theologian. Can someone interpret this and tell me what this means? I thought the Trinity has 3 persons. Is this the context in which he means it? And didn't God call people to him? I thought so. Unless we know that in Islam, God does not come to earth. In Islam, God spoke through Mohammed, and God sent Gabriel or Jibreel or gibberish. Sorry, the angel gibberish. Yeah, that's what. Allah sent the angel gibberish. So God does not communicate his word with the earth or with the angels. There are no persons in God, and God calleth unto him no foreign person. So God would never call Jews to him, I guess. Understand, I don't understand this. I genuinely don't. Is this a mistranslation? Is this a typo in the text? How do I read this? How do I understand this? Because this doesn't strike me as remotely orthodox. Palestinian Muslims at the time of Jesus? Of course. Of course, Jesus was a Palestinian. As you know, Jesus was also Buddhist. Jesus also didn't exist, and Jesus was also Sol Invictus. Jesus was also Attis of Phrygia. Jesus was also... Yeah, you pick the story. Jesus was a Palestinian Muslim, Lloyd. Don't deny the truth. Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Luther told me so. Yes. Yeah, let's continue. So Luther put the book of James in the appendix. He did. Moved it into the middle of the Bible and some of it at the back eventually. So Calvin treats the Jewish interpreters as a group and dismisses them as being blind for failing to recognize Christ in the Old Testament. He calls the prominent Jewish biblical commentator Don Isaac Abarbanel a charlatan and a dog. So yeah, I guess that's so Calvin obviously, so obviously these Calvinists, these Christians who think Jews are evil and Jews are dogs, did not get it from Calvin, did not get it from Luther. They got it directly from I don't know where, but clearly not from these wonderful role models. Calvin considered the Jews' refusal to adopt Christianity, even in its reformed model, that's their version of it, as a sign of their wickedness, ungratefulness, and rebelliousness. I only called you dogs. I only said you were wicked and evil and satanic demons who drink blood, murder children, kidnap children, right? That you kill babies, eat babies, drink their blood. Why won't you join my religion? I don't get it. I don't get it. I only said that people should burn your synagogues, burn your houses, beat you up, steal your stuff. I don't understand why you wouldn't want to join my religion. I don't get it. Yeah, Calvin, Luther. Wonderful guys. So, of course, Calvin's statements, the Jews make themselves altogether ridiculous in pretending that God held communication with the earth or with angels. This is an English translation of Calvin's statement above, in more modern English. But it is well that their canine wickedness has been joined with a stupidity so great that they betray their folly to children. Christians, therefore, properly contend from this testimony that there exists a plurality of persons in the Godhead. So there exists a plurality of persons in the Godhead. I'm not reading that here. There are no persons in God. So, yeah. I don't know. This doesn't make sense to me. So, moving on. And Calvin asserted the Jews' greatest crime consisted in their lack of faith in Jesus. Apparently not in murdering Jesus, but so Calvin wrote, if we compare the Jews with other nations, surely their impiety, ingratitude, and rebelliousness exceeded the crimes of all other nations. So, on the questions and objections of the Jews, a response from John Calvin. He writes, the Jews are impure dogs, pigs, beasts, ungrateful people, liars. Hey, do you want to join my church? I've got the true church, you impure dogs, pigs, beasts, you ungrateful people, and you liars. Come and join my church. I got the true church. Jesus speaks through me. I am so Christ-like. I can't understand why Jews didn't want to join their church. It's a mystery. It's a mystery to me. And he called them the children of the devil. Despite the absence of Jews in France and the Swiss cantons at that time, Calvin antagonized Jews and Judaism in the theological sphere. Yes, so we need to stop saying that it was Catholics that added books to the canon. Yeah, no, it was the Protestants that removed the books. I'll get to that in the future. So, let me see. Okay, so Melanchthon was influenced by Martin Luther's anti-Semitism. This is Melanchthon, who was Martin Luther's right-hand man. It was Melanchthon who publicly uncovered the falseness. Now, this is Martin Luther's right-hand man, okay? This is the closest companion this is the Abu Bakr to Mohammed, okay? This is the closest companion to Martin Luther himself. And he publicly uncovered the falseness of the 1510 Brandenburg blood libel, which caused the burning of 38 innocent Jews. So while Martin Luther was accusing the Jews of everything, and Jews were being murdered, burned, murdered, killed, right? He discovered that the blood libel that they were accused of was false. And he says, although this was a part of his attack on the Catholic Church, falsifying evidence and sending innocent people to death. So when it was convenient, he would defend the Jews and show that, look, these are lies, but of course he could use it as a propaganda tactic against the Catholic Church. Now you've got Jonas, so a different guy, Justus Jonas, a Lutheran theologian and reformer, professor and hymn writer. So he assisted Luther with the translation of the Bible into the German language, right? Jonas distorted Luther's views, which resulted in a pro-Jewish viewpoint. Kaufmann notes that Jonas thought that Luther's von den Juden und ihren Lügen, on the Jews and their lies, was important, and he translated it into Latin. Interesting. Then you know Andreas Osiander. Andreas Osiander is the guy that, when Copernicus released his book, Andreas Osiander wrote in the foreword to the book, a false foreword to the book, that stated that these were not the opinions of Copernicus, and therefore he delayed the publishing of Copernicus's theory for 60 plus years, for 62 years. And of course, the Copernican theory was delayed for more than 6 decades because of this guy, a follower of Luther, who ran the printing press. And of course, he prevented the truth from coming out about the Copernican revolution. So yeah, and of course, Luther called it basically superstition. I have a video on that if you guys want to check. on Copernicus. In May 1529, the Jews of Pezinok, Hungary, were blamed for a ritual murder. They were imprisoned and tortured until they confessed the crime, and 30 men, women, and children were burned, while those who were under the age 10 were forced to baptize and adopt Christianity. In the same year, Osiander wrote an anonymous tract in which he rejects the Pezinok blood libel charge and systematically refutes the charge of the Jewish ritual murder of Christian children. So he actually did something good for once. The tract that was published in 1540 was criticized by Johannes Eck, who was one of the main opponents of Martin Luther, who condemned Osiander as a protector of bloodthirsty Jews and prohibited by Martin Luther. Right? So this tract was prohibited by Martin Luther, who obviously wanted to blame Jews. In the same year, the corpse of a child was found in Sappenfeld near Eichstätt, Bavaria, and the Jews were blamed for killing him and using his blood for ritual purposes. Osiander defended the Jews and prevented their persecution. So Osiander condemned Luther's anti-Jewish tract von Shem Hamphoras und vom Geschlecht Christi on the Shem Hamphoras on the Tetragrammaton. Remember, this is where Martin Luther stated that the name Yahweh, right, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, the name of Yahweh that the Jews use, they pulled out of a pig's ass. Okay? And of course, the image of Christ. Thus, in contrast to Luther, who stained the Jews with blood libel, Osiander defended the innocent Jews against false accusations. So these accusations were leading to people getting killed. Now, there were some other Christian scholars who studied Hebrew and the Old Testament in its original language, and they became pro-Jewish. One of those is Michael Servetus. Michael Servetus, you might remember, is the man that Calvinists are forced to admit, I believe it's the same guy, that Calvinists are forced to admit that Calvin had him killed, had him murdered. Okay, so Calvin ordered that this man be assassinated, and this man was killed at the order of Calvin. Now, that is a very difficult history to look through. I've looked through it. It's very hard to find the facts. They're very well hidden, just like the stuff on Luther, but Calvin apparently must have been responsible for the death of at least 60 people, so 60-something people. So, Lloyd, South Africa is a Lutheran country, and Mandela's Marxist turned into a Soviet-style republic. I don't think it's necessarily Calvinist. But yeah, I mean, South Africa is a very Christian country, but it's definitely Dutch Reformed. It would be Dutch Reformed. So yeah, whatever that is. And of course, Marxist Mandela did turn it into a Soviet-style republic. Dr. Jonathan Gemmell, I wonder what Erasmus thought about Luther's anti-Semitism. Erasmus was an interesting character. Well, he was an anti-Semite himself. Right, talk about hate speech. So people died at the command of Peter by the Holy Ghost. Elijah mocks the false gods. I have no idea what that's about. Okay, so guys, so it is true that Luther was not the only Christian theologian, religious leader, and reformer in 16th century Europe who uttered anti-Jewish sentiments and demonstrated anti-Jewish hostility. However, Luther's anti-Jewishness, anti-Semitism, and racism are unique and unparalleled by any of those contemporary theologians and reformers. There were some other theologians and reformers who did not attack the Jews and even spoke out in defense. So, Luther did not invent anti-Judaism. However, he spread hatred against the Pope, against the German peasants, against the Turks, and above all, against the Jews and Judaism. He led his followers in a negative direction. He escalated the animosity much more than the historical church and firmly deepened, fueled, and inflamed it. And thus he brought it to peaks that were never seen before until the arrival of Adolf Hitler. So he eventually fueled actions that had disastrous consequences. Scholarly justification of Luther's extreme Judeophobia ultimately attempts to excuse the inexcusable, as if Martin Luther were just a son of his time, or they whitewash it. They try to make it like it wasn't much. And this whole son of his time is historically inaccurate and therefore does not explain anything. David Sand says, apologies, I was behind listening about Calvin's comments that God calls to himself no foreign persons. Yeah, I have no idea what that's about. I'd have to look into that. It's just in the document. It's probably in a footnote, but feel free to go back, check through the video, or download the document, check the footnote. That just wasn't relevant to me in terms of discussing Jews, at least in terms of this talk. So, section 4, cross or expulsion and death. Let me see here. Accept Islam or death. Yeah, it sounds kind of Muslim myself. The key factor for Luther's Judeophobia. Luther expressed anti-Jewish assertions in 1513 or 1515, right, before the publication of his positive work that Jesus Christ was born a Jew. So the man was anti-Jewish even before he got to writing the nice thing. That everyone goes, well, Martin Luther wrote this really nice thing. We should really think about that. So, and he says here, Christ prays. So here in Psalms 109, he says, Christ prays for the punishment for his traitor, Judas, and for the Jews. So Christ prays for the punishment of the Jews as a collective ethnic group. So Martin Luther is calling for collective punishment, which is a war crime, by the way. We define that as a war crime. So now here's where Luther again twists scripture. Psalm 109 is often interpreted as a plea for deliverance from enemies and a call for God's righteous judgment. So in Psalms 109, Christ does not pray for the punishment for his traitor Judas or for punishment for the Jews. The Psalms, including Psalm 109, are understood in a messianic context, with Christ being the fulfillment of the prophecies contained within them. Psalm 109 is seen as a prophecy of the divine promises regarding Christ, foretelling the coming of our Lord, Savior, Jesus Christ. The Psalms prayed by Christ and fulfilled in him remain essential to the prayer of the church, recalling the saving events of the past and awaiting the Messiah. So Psalm 109 is to be understood in the context of Christ's fulfillment of the Old Testament, and not as prayers for the punishment against individuals or groups. Now, that was the standard understanding for a long time, but of course Martin Luther was like, Christ wanted everyone to be, well, the Jews to be punished, right, as a collective. Now, of course, collective punishment is a war crime. Now, if someone was guilty, fine, present the evidence, call them guilty, punish them according to the law. But Martin Luther wants all Jews with no exceptions. So, it is prophesied by all prophets that the Jews again, as a collective, curse and blaspheme God and their King Jesus Christ. And anyone who does not perceive and understand this has truly understood nothing of theology. In 1521, a comment or short homily in Apostle, he goes further and characterizes all the Jews as potential murderers, probably alluding to the Christian accusation of Jews as ritual murderers and well poisoners. So Christus betet Strafe für seinen Verräter Judas und für die Juden. So Christ prays for punishment for his betrayer Judas and for the Jews. That's what Martin Luther writes. That's the way he interprets things. So Luther describes the book of Malachi as follows. A summary of this prophet is that he makes the synagogue passé and describes it as a thing of contempt. So a Jew is describing the synagogue as something that's contemptuous, like an old woman now about to be deserted. Therefore, almost all the words which are here spoken in the name of the Lord echo a sort of disgust. So the book of Malachi is about Malachi's disgust for Jewish practice, because Malachi was a Jew and therefore he hated Jews, and Jews are disgusting, according to Martin Luther. The Lord has had enough and is, as it were, disgusted by the ceremonies of the Jews. Fascinating. So, in 1526, he writes on Psalm 109 again. David made the psalm in the spirit of Christ, who speaks it against Judas, the traitor, and against the whole of Judaism. Now he's precise. He wants collective punishment of the Jews. He wants them all to be harmed, as it will happen to them. And now he says, as it will happen to them. All the Jews will be punished. So Martin Luther wanted the Jews punished. In 1533, he escalates even more and writes, the 109th Psalm is a prayer psalm that Christ prays against his traitor Judas and his crucifiers, the Jews. Now, it's no longer the Romans that crucified, it's the Jews did it themselves. They were just dressed in Roman clothing, I guess. He complains about them violently and foretells how they will perish and how they must be perished or killed horribly by God's wrath, as we see it all fulfilled before our eyes. So, at the early stages of his career, he was already, even when he was being nice to Jews, he was already at that period writing nasty things about how he's going to punish them. Just like the Muslims were writing about the same thing, oddly enough. And then afterwards, until the end of his life, in all these periods, Luther uttered anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic assertions. Della Harpe, historian, stresses that one can expect to find in Luther's table talks only a wrathful Jew hater. So he was an angry Jew hater. Okay? Zornbrannte Judenhasser. Therefore, it seems that Luther never detached himself completely from animosity against Jews. Now, he says the Christian animosity. Now, the Catholic Church has made an about turn on this point. He just changed his rhetoric on the surface for a short time to obtain a political goal. The fundamental theological guidelines and beliefs that lie behind his approach toward Jews and Judaism never genuinely changed. Luther's Judeophilia was deliberately planned from the very beginning. It was meant for a limited time and was conditional. Even then, he did not stop his harsh rhetoric against the Jews. It was a tactical approach, taking advantage of the unfortunate situation, intent on achieving religious, political, and other targets, as Martin Luther multiple times stressed, until I see what I have accomplished. Right? So I'm going to give them a chance, and otherwise, if they don't, we will punish them, and they will see. Jesus Christ is Lord says, so Jesus Christ is Lord, excuse my French, but fuck you. Okay, so you are on the same page as someone who is on the same page as Hitler, on the same page as Mohammed, and you are praising this. So you are saying that the moral example of Protestantism, the man who founded the theology that you follow, the man who writes this hatred, the man who espouses hatred, violence, and murder, you're saying that his philosophies, his theology, which is designed to be contrary to that of the Jews, designed to be contrary to the people who brought you the Bible, to be contrary to the early church fathers, who is now a contrarian. Sola Fide's Bible, Ephesians 2:8-9. First of all, you are taking the word of a liar. You are taking the word of someone who said that Jesus Christ was having sex, sleeping around with multiple women. You are taking the word of someone who endorsed bigamy, polygamy, allowed people to marry multiple wives. You are taking the word of someone who allowed murder, called for murder. You see, as a Protestant, you of course ignore evidence, you ignore history, you ignore the early church fathers. Okay, we're done here. So we're done here. Thank you and goodbye. You are in denial. Okay, you are defending someone who called for murder and genocide, someone who got millions of people killed, someone who had whose actions resulted in 75% of the population of Germany being murdered. You are historically illiterate. You are incredibly morally corrupt. You are someone who is in denial about the truth, about history. You are saying, well, I believe in the Bible only because Martin Luther made that, the idea that you have in your head. You got that from Martin Luther. Your religious theology comes from a man who was a liar, a murderer, someone who endorsed polygamy, someone who endorsed genocide, someone who endorsed hatred. You should be ashamed of yourself. You genuinely should be deeply ashamed of yourself. You need to go and learn some truth. Stop lying to yourself, because you are not going to lie to me. Because you can go, well, the Bible, the Bible, the Bible. What about facts? What about history? What about evidence? You turn to the Bible because you have no facts on your side. You have no evidence on your side. You do not have history on your side. This is simply a way to claim to be moral because the Bible, so that you can get away from facts that show that the person who founded your religion was a vile, evil, disgusting man. So yeah, you keep defending someone who is literally saying the same things as Hitler and the same things as Mohammed, and say that, well, he's got nothing to do with my religion. This is the founder of your religion. This is the founder of the Protestant theology. Your solas, we just discussed, and you're an idiot. You're dumb. You're stupid. We just discussed that Martin Luther admitted openly in his own words, in his own writings, and I showed it, that the word sola does not exist in the Bible. He openly admitted it. It does not exist. And then, of course, you come along and, well, it's actually in a different verse. Because when we prove to the Muslims that Jesus is not in Isaiah 42, they'll go, well, it's actually in Joshua 33. No, it's actually in Mark 22. No, actually, it's in Acts 14. Because you guys will make up any lie at any time. Because once you prove one lie wrong, you'll make up another lie. You'll make up a fresh lie. Martin Luther admitted in his own words the word sola is not in the Bible, and he personally put it there. That's his own words. I put that in the beginning of the video. I showed that. Martin Luther's own words. So yeah, it's not in the Bible. Martin Luther said, of course you're going to say, well, my theology has nothing to do with Martin Luther. Yes, and your parents have nothing to do with your birth either, right? You just popped out of space. Just, boom, there you go. Stork brought you. Mom and dad didn't have sex and have you as a baby, right? Your parents, sorry, go lie to someone else, F off. So, excuse me for that rant, but man, I get upset. Let me catch up on the comments. Dino Dennis, yes, he says you are using Luther's theology. He is using Luther's theology, and he's denying it. He's lying about it. Understand? And of course, he's not trying to, he's not saying, yes, Luther was wrong about this. No, he's defending Luther by trying to deflect. But just like Muslims do, it's exactly the same apologetics. So the Newman quote again, to be deep in history is to cease to be a Protestant. Wow, I can't believe anyone would side with Luther for anything. He's so sad. Yeah. Let me see. So dangerous dogs like this preaching from pulpits. Thank God for excommunication in the Apostolic Church. Yeah. So FM Knight of the Immaculate Heart says, that's funny. Last I checked, our Lord instructed us to love our enemies. Yes. So even if the Jews were enemies, we're supposed to love them. What's sad is that we have to love people like Luther. Yeah. So let's see. Agusi Bro single-handedly hating on his enemies and banning their words. So you know what? You can get lost too. Take care, buddy. Bye-bye. Right. Have a nice day. Okay, now let's continue. So, to love is to wish for the highest good. Tough love is an expression of love too. Yeah. So, I am not under any obligation to permit propaganda. I'm not under any obligation to entertain stupidity. You are free to go and lie on any channel that you like to. You are free to go and misrepresent the truth and repeat Luther's lies, because you are repeating the lies of Martin Luther. You are repeating the errors of Martin Luther. You can go do that anywhere else. I do not allow you to take a dump on my lawn. It's very simple. This is my lawn. If you want to tell lies, go do it somewhere else. If you want to deny facts, go do it somewhere else. I am not going to entertain you. So would you allow people to come into your church, for instance, and start swearing and blaspheming and arguing about the Bible being false, and the Bible was written by a guy called Frank in 1931 and it was actually fake and the CIA wrote it? No, you wouldn't. Why would I entertain you here? Now, moving on. So, without saying it, Luther gave the Jews a choice to join the newly reformed true religion and enjoy the possibility of being integrated into Christian society, or they can continue to keep their own false religion, but then they would be treated by the well-known traditional church oppressions. That's the very same choice Muhammad gave to the Jews. That's the very same choice Muhammad gave to the Christians. You can keep your religion, but then, of course, you're going to have to pay the jizya and feel yourself subdued. So Martin Luther was taking a page out of Muhammad's book here. So in the moment that Martin Luther admitted the Jews' refusal to convert was conclusive, he ended his limited, short-lived Judeophilia and reverted to hostility towards them. He was always convinced that the Jews only had the choice of either accepting Islam and integrating, or being humbled and oppressed. Either accept Islam, or we will humble you. Yeah, Muhammad gave that choice to people as well. You may have heard of it. So the factor of the disappointment as such does not explain Luther's radical hatred of Jews. His failure to convert them was also a partial failure of his Reformation. Martin Luther had said, well, the popes couldn't do it, but me, Martin Luther, I'm such a wonderful guy, I'm going to make them convert. Of course, he failed. So, he failed. Luther did not simply want to go back to the well-known anti-Jewish policy of the church as it was, but rather to replace it by even more hatred of Jews and a harsher pressure on them. In other words, the Jewish refusal brought Luther not only back to the church's historical hostile policy towards Jews, but even far beyond it. He increased his hatred by various methods. He stopped supporting the Jews altogether and even pushed the princes to expel them. So remember, Martin Luther, just like Muhammad, stated, you, the Jews, should know that Arabia is ours, and I will expel you from Arabia, which is what Muhammad did. Right? The Jews were forced to convert, or they were treated harshly, and they were expelled from wherever they were by the Muslims too. Martin Luther's continuing this proud Muslim tradition. So Rose of Sharon says, Luther sounds like a rabid Muslim. Sounds like when they invaded Europe at various times, they imparted their Jew-loving wisdom to the locals. Because that's what's coming through here. Yes, and that's exactly what I pick up as well. There's far too much Islam in Martin Luther's policies here. So, Lloyd, have you come across The Salvation Comes from the Jews, Moroi Skuman? Very interesting chapter on Muslims working with Hitler. Yeah, I've covered the Muslims working with Hitler in depth. I've covered that intensively. Look at my series on Palestine, the Soviet Palestine, and of course the Soviet occupation, the Palestinian occupation of Israel. I've covered that extensively. So the purpose was clear: to push the Jews as hard as possible until they accepted the church religion or abolish them culturally and physically, which is genocide. Legally, that is defined as genocide. In his own words, until they sprawl down on the floor and stay there, unable to move. This was in fact a renewed version of 1096's cross or death of the Crusaders in the Rhineland. That's the Crusaders in Germany. Germany is always doing such weird things. Or following through the paradigm of cross or expulsion that took place in Spain and Portugal in Luther's own time. The Jews had to choose either to become Christians, which means disappearance but physical existence, or to vanish in both ways, physically and culturally. They cannot continue challenging Christianity by their very, very physical existence and by their lies and false biblical interpretations and as a revival religion. Just like the Muslims, Martin Luther wanted to punish the Jews, and also, just like Mohammed and just like the Muslims, accused the Jews of falsifying the Bible. He accused them of corrupting the Bible by mistranslating it. So he accused them of tahrif of the Bible in a very similar fashion to the way Muslims did. Luther blamed the Jews for their unwillingness to accept Jesus as Messiah because of their stubbornness. This term means a resistance against God's will and disobeying God's commandments. The punishment for such a sin is the inability to receive divine blessing, humiliation, and destruction, kind of like what the Muslims say. So in Vom Shem Hamforas, remember this is where Martin Luther said that the name Yahweh comes out of a pig's ass. He asserts that to convert the Jews is about as possible as converting the devil. For a Jew or a Jewish heart is so stone, iron, devil hard that it cannot be moved by any means. So now, very close to the end, we should be finishing shortly, I hope. So Luther packs the Jews together with the devils, with the Turks, and all the godless who must use God's name continuously and violate the commandment. The rhetoric is shocking in its harshness, but it did not come from nowhere. Already in 1526, Luther was willing to say that Satan stood at the right hand of the Jews. We are now speaking not with the Jews, but rather about the Jews and about their actions. He makes clear that the Jewish question can find its solution either by converting or by humiliating and oppressing them until they would be eliminated. In other words, make them dhimmis, like the Muslims would. I cannot convert the Jews. Our Lord Jesus Christ did not succeed in doing so either. But I can shut their mouths so that there will be nothing for them to do but sprawl down on the floor and stay there, being unable to move. In his 3 manifestos published in 1543, Luther expresses his ethnic anti-Semitism and makes clear how he is going to shut the mouths of the Jews. In the first 2 manifestos, von den Juden in ihren Lügen und vom Shem Hamforas und vom Geschlecht Christi, Luther calls the Jews devils, which symbolizes in Christianity, and not only there, the enemy of God and all evil on the earth, disgusting bugs, a pest in the heart of our territories. Everybody knows what should be done with the devil, a pest, and with bugs. They should be eliminated. In Von den Juden und ihren Lügen, Luther defines the Jews as bloodthirsty bloodhounds and murderers of all Christendom. He suggests in 7 harsh proposals to the German authorities how to handle them. Exercise a sharp mercy against these miserable people. Burn their synagogues and their schools, their prayer books and their Talmuds, and do not leave a page. Forbid everything that I have explained above, religious services and teachings. Force them to work, in other words, slave labor, Arbeit macht frei, labor camps, and handle them with all mercilessness, as Moses did in the wilderness, and struck 3,000 dead so that the whole house must not be spoiled. He also calls for erasing their house and for their expulsion from the German territories. Luther calls the Jews children of darkness and devils and accuses them of practicing nothing but blasphemy, cursing, murder, and lies against the true Jews in Israel, the Christians. That is, against the apostles and the prophets, and he calls them perverters of the Holy Scripture. Even in his very last sermon on February 15, 1546, 2 or 3 days before his death, Luther describes the Jews as the Christians' enemies, accuses them of defaming the core figures of Christianity, and ascribes a homicidal character to the Jews. This offensive language inflamed hatred against the Jews. In the same breath, Luther gives the Jews the alternative between acceptance of Christianity and integration or expulsion or disappearance from society. The Jews are our public enemies. They never stop defaming our Lord Christ, calling the Virgin Mary a whore, and Jesus Christ the son of a whore. If they could, they would gladly kill us all. Still, we wish to practice Christian love towards them and ask them to convert and accept the Lord, and if they don't, we'll kill them. That was Martin Luther. That's what Christ would do. Threaten people, and if they don't, kill them. So, is there any rationale for Martin Luther or Calvin's hatred for the Jews? Yeah, they do cover that. They do discuss this, but Martin Luther was a hateful man. Martin Luther was a violent man. Anyone that wasn't pure, anyone that didn't conform to Martin Luther's version of purity was an enemy and must be killed. Anyone that didn't conform to his interpretation was bad and must be hated. So he spoke in the most hateful, violent terms towards people and incited violence. He also was very much in line with the Gnostic ideas. Martin Luther had a lot of Gnostic parallels. So he would have followed the Gnostic idea that the Jews are... So he believed in John 8:44. He interpreted as the Jews are that Yahweh, right? We'll get to 8:44, John 8:44. It's in this document, but he basically says that their God is the father of the devil. That Yahweh, the God of the Bible, is the father of the devil. So he took on board that basic idea from the Gnostics, or something similar to that. So to him, their God is Satan, which is a Gnostic idea. And therefore they had to go because they were evil. The French Jacobins did apparently use, so in the French Revolution, the Jacobins did take on Martin Luther's ideas. There's definitely a parallel there. Hitler was not hateful, he was simply a Protestant. That might well be the case. Okay. Still, so if the Jews want to convert to us and give up their heresy and whatever else they've done to us, we will gladly forgive them, but if not, we will not tolerate nor suffer that they should be in our midst. So his plan to expel the Jews from the German territories was not theoretical. He not only refused to prevent the expulsion of the Jews of Saxony, but also advocated for it. In his table talks, Luther suggests that the Jews blaspheme Mary. In his letters to his wife, Katharina von Bora, he associates the Jews with the devil and talks about expelling them from Eisleben. So, yeah. So, now, Nicole de la Harpe, again, the historian we mentioned earlier, this particular author says, how could this woman write that Luther had a sympathy, yes, a solidarity with the Jewish people? He wanted them dead. But so historians, he had a real solidarity with the Jewish people. It goes much further than normal sympathy for fellow human beings in an emergency. He loved him some Jews, according to this particular historian, who must have been blind. Some comments by Luther about the Jews and his behavior towards them are parallel to his behavior and comments about the German peasants. His conduct towards Jews on the one hand and towards the German peasants on the other reflect a violent element in his personality. This is also evidenced by Luther's harsh condemnations of the Pope. In fact, many of his references to the Jews, he puts them together with the Turks, the Pope, and Mohammed. So yeah, that's great. Turk, Pope, Jews, who are all alike, the whole evil host of the world and the devil. So let me see, with his hatred of the Jews and his hatred of the Pope and his hatred of Catholics, do you think that he was going to accept Catholic interpretations, or he's going to change the interpretations and thus go against and contradict the words of the early church fathers? He's going to contradict old, well-established, traditional interpretation of the Bible. Of course he's going to go against it. So he says, the whole evil host of the world and the devil, and a dismissal of Jews, Mohammed, Turks, and Tatars, with their spoonful or nutshell of brain. Luther's siding with the German princes and dukes reveals a self-serving socio-economic adherence to the strong party who would support him in his Reformation. So he was getting money and support and protection from the German princes, and therefore he sided for them. He basically sold out his theology to defend them against the Catholics. And even at the cost. So here, Luther sided with the German princes and dukes for socio-economic and political reasons, right? He was adherent to the strong political party at the cost of violating justice, morality, and biblical ethics, including the slaughter of many tens of thousands of peasants, and the suppression of Jews by burning their synagogues, their houses and books, as well as expelling them from the German territories. Because that's what Jesus would do. He was a shrewd politician who was ready to do everything in order to advance his goals, by peaceful means for a limited time, by brutal violence and mass bloodshed and the suffering of innocent people. But sola scriptura is true, guys. You must ignore all of this stuff, and sola scriptura is true, even though Martin Luther, in his own words, says, yeah, that word's not in the Bible, but I'm saying it's there. I'm telling you it's there. I'm putting it there, because Martin Luther damn well says so. So yeah, the goal justifies the means. Now, this idea of the ends justifies the means is quite literally a part of the Sharia. It is the first rule of the Sharia, right? Well, the 6 pillars of the Sharia, the ends justify the means is literally Muslim Sharia. If nasty behavior towards Jews can push them to convert or to disappear, then it is fine. If thousands of dead peasants would bring Luther closer to the German princes, then that is fine as well. Luther sold out his principles. He got 100,000 people murdered because that got him in the good graces of the princes. Nearly finished. Michael Servetus. Now the latter, this is the guy that apparently, I believe this is the same guy that Calvin had killed. The latter cited medieval Jewish exegetes and thinkers not only to interpret difficult biblical texts, but also to reevaluate Christian theological dogmas. So he was a little bit of a we call it Judeophile. He was studying the Hebraists, or the Jews who'd written the Bible. He was looking at their interpretations, and he was favorable towards them. Thus, Servetus denied the Christian explanation of Isaiah 7:14 as a prediction of Jesus' birth, and even invoked the testimony of Jews against Trinitarian doctrine. And of course, John Calvin had him killed. So, yeah, I guess, yeah. John Calvin praises David Kimchi's exegesis, who was a Jew, oddly enough, and apparently Luther was afraid that the Jews would influence or dominate Christian scholars and society, and to some extent even challenge Christianity and his Reformed Church. In winter 1542, just before the publication of his manifesto against Jews, Luther spoke at a table talk as follows: "O the Hebrews, I mean also those of ours who Judaize it too much. That is why I also meant them in the book I wrote against the Jews." So Martin Luther is saying here that his hatred of the Jews is also directed at those who are too friendly to the Jews. He didn't like anyone being friendly to Jews. He says, many Hebraists are more rabbinic than Christian, more Jewish than Christian. They do not look for Jesus in the Old Testament. This means they reject the allegorical and Christological interpretation of the Old Testament as a prediction of Jesus. So this is reason to hate them. So Rose of Sharon says, he sounds like an Islamist. He hates Jews and Christians and infiltrates to destroy the church from within. Something about this guy, for sure. Honestly, how do Lutherans and Protestants not know the history of their filthy leader? Or do they know and they ignore? Well, you saw they don't want to hear. They cannot hear it. They refuse to hear it. It's minds are closed here. They've been look, from an indoctrination viewpoint, it's not like they were necessarily taught, but this is the worldview that has been passed down. Certain phrases, certain meanings, certain ideas, staying away from other ideas, pushing certain interpretations. It's implicit. It's inherent in the worldview. It's very, very difficult. It's easier to fool people than to convince them they've been fooled. Is there a proposition that Luther was a part of the German elite, since there was also secret elites that had secretive places? There's a possibility there. Just your boy Jay, there's a possibility. So FM Knight of the Immaculate Heart says, the ones who defend Christianity are Luther and the likes. I wish he chose a different label for his new religion besides Christianity. Yeah, yep. So Blue Dragon says, rage seems to be a Protestant curse. If you live with one, your spirit gets infected. Yeah. So in his lectures on Psalms, Luther stresses every prophecy and prophet must be understood as referencing to Christ the Lord, and complains there are some Christians who interpret many Psalms not prophetically regarding Jesus, but rather historically. And by doing so, they justify the Hebrews rabbis, who are falsifiers and inventors of the vanities of the Jews. So yeah, he does accuse Jews of falsifying the Bible, but of course he is now subtly also rejecting history. You saw the guy that came on earlier, the idiot who came earlier, rejects history. He doesn't care about history. No, show me in the Bible. Because they know that history is not on their side. History would show them to be wrong. There's no historical evidence to support their view. Yes, you can find historical evidence in the known heretics and the Gnostics. And we're talking flaming heretics and flaming Gnostics who are clearly not Christian. You can find evidence for those ideas there, certainly, but not amongst the early Christians. So, in my opinion, Luther was the worst heretic that ever lived. That's Dr. Jonathan Gemmell. Okay, let's try and finish this. Luther made a clear-cut distinction between the biblical Israel, whom he admired, and to whom Christians consider themselves the legitimate heir and continuation, and the blind, Talmudic, heretical Jews whom he despised and whose biblical interpretations he considered lies. His dismissal not only of rabbinic literature and Jewish biblical interpretation, but also their biblical literary heritage, such as Esther and Maccabees, reflect his general ignorance of Jewish culture, religion, moral values, and ethics. Think of the Ten Commandments. He rejects the Old Testament. He rejects the Jewish interpretation of things. Yet, the Ten Commandments, right? So he says nothing good has come out of the Jewish interpretations. Nothing good has come out of the Old Testament. Everything good came only from the Christian Bible, the New Testament. That's what Martin Luther said. So what do we think of the Ten Commandments? Is that like chopped liver? Well, what is it, right? So he says he rejects Jewish culture, religion, moral values, and ethics, which particularly contributed so much to Christianity and Western culture. Luther targeted it as a threat to Christian culture and wished to silence it. So he would be contrarian. So whatever is established, he's going to reverse that. He's going to go against it. So understand, he would then have to reject Moses. He would have to, exactly, right? That's right, he rejected Moses. So he would have to reject whatever. So in other words, his is a counter theology. It's a contrary theology. It is a theology that goes against existing theology. So, yeah, understand the problem here. So this says there are numerous sources regarding ethical and moral values, such as Genesis 18, 19, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, right? Even in the Talmud, there are certain things which, if you read it, there's actually some good stuff and there's a lot of weird stuff in there, right? So, yeah, see the letter of former President John Adams. So look at the American President John Adams to then President Thomas Jefferson. I will insist that the Hebrews have done more to civilize man than any other nations. American writer Mark Twain stated, if the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and learning are also a way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. That's Mark Twain concerning the Jews, the essay. Let me try and finish this because I really want to get done with this. Luther considered himself one of God's messengers and often described himself as a prophet. I know a guy called Mohammed who also described himself as a prophet. Did he fear that he would be killed by the Jews as well, whether directly or through some kind of supernatural or magical power? Luther, who believed in the devil and described the Jews as devils, this was a plausible fear. Luther believed in a mysterious evil power of Jews and their willingness to hurt him physically. He often asserts that the Jews wished to kill all Christians. The Jews were also blamed for making a secret pact with the Turks, serving them as spies and by magical practices. We know that the Protestants were supported by the Turks. The Ottoman Turks supported and funded the Protestants. Otherwise, the Protestant Revolution would have failed. These irrational issues are reflected in his letter of February 1546, where he complains to his wife that his sickness and dizziness might be due to having passed by a Jewish neighborhood near Eisleben. Anti-Jewish offensiveness appears already in the New Testament. It is followed and developed by the Church Fathers, theologians, and exegetes through the centuries. Verses such as in Matthew 23 have had a serious effect on pious Christian believers like Luther. Therefore I send you prophets, sages, and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town, so that upon you may come all the innocent bloodshed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. O Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones the messengers sent to her. Now Muslims hold this against the Jews, and so does Martin Luther. So do those who hate the Jews. Now, of course, they ignore the positives that's also in the Bible, and they will interpret these in the most uncharitable manner possible, in the nastiest manner possible. Queen Elizabeth, I believe, did make an alliance with the Turks, yes. So, Luther is considered the prophet. Luther was considered. He called himself a prophet, and he was considered the prophet of the Germans, right? Leppen compares Luther to the biblical prophets who were engaged in the mission of God and struggled against powerful rulers. I've already covered this in a previous episode where Martin Luther becomes this prophet. Similarly, John Calvin viewed himself as a prophet and divine messenger of his time, right? So, yeah. Martin Luther devoted 17 sermons to Matthew 23 between 1538 and 39. That's this verse that discusses the Jews as killers. He asks why Jesus should say that the blood of all the righteous from Abel onward should come upon the Jews, even if they were certainly not responsible for all those deaths. Because he says, well, the Jews are to blame because the Jews are just evil. Right? Yes, he was poisoned by Jews too. Yeah, he believed so. He answers that this reflects the Jewish character. You see, it is a people in nature, a race, as the fathers, so the children. So now lots of people defend Martin Luther by saying, well, no, he had a theological hatred of Jews, which is okay because that's normal, right? That's okay. Jesus would want that too. But he wasn't like an anti-Semite in that he had a racial hatred of them. Well, he says they're a race that are evil. So I guess that's wrong, that he was simply just hating them on theological grounds. That's an excuse that is weak and false. You Jews should be the first to whom the apostles, evangelists, and others were sent, because the Messiah was promised to you. But you will fulfill the measure of your fathers. They struck the prophets. Therefore, your house should be laid waste. So because you killed the prophets, you should also be destroyed. He wanted the punishment to come on them. The sermon as a whole is primarily focused on condemning Christians, especially Catholic leaders and monks, for rejecting the apostles and prophets' values. Hold on. He condemns Catholics for rejecting the prophets and the apostles' values. So he doesn't just blame Jews. Martin Luther now also says that the Catholics rejected the apostles. The Catholics rejected the prophets. The Catholics are just so bad. As you can see, Martin Luther is extremely Christ-like, and there's nothing like Mohammed or Hitler in Martin Luther's behavior at all. It does not include a similar hope for eventual Jewish conversion. So he hopes that the Catholics will come to Christ, but yeah, those Jews, no chance. One of the nastiest, and perhaps also the earliest, anti-Jewish statements in the New Testament, which was uttered by either Paul himself or by a later Christian, that's 1 Thessalonians 2, 14-16, who updated Paul's letter sometime after 70 AD. You, the Thessalonians, have fared like the congregations in Judea, God's people in Christ Jesus. You have been treated by your countrymen as they are treated by the Jews, who killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out, the Jews who are neglectful of God's will and enemies of their fellow men. Now, I did state last time I spoke about this that it's unfortunate that these words are written. I said sadly it was written by Paul. The issue being that these are going to be interpreted in the worst possible light. You get idiots like this. There's one certain guy with a little bit of a Hitler mustache, claims to be a good Christian, and says very, very hateful things on YouTube and other places, that they will take these and then use this as a justification of hatred. I would think we should not find justification of hatred of an entire group. Another example is John 8:44. You are from your father, the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning. And he states that this is about the Jewish God, who is the father. And in fact, there was a Gnostic interpretation that was commonly taken. You are the father. So basically they claim it's you are the father of the devil, right? So that they claim that Yahweh is either the father of the devil or the devil. So understand, so Martin Luther is leaning into this whole Gnostic view of the Jews being fathered by the devil, or they are the sons of the father of the devil, right? So something like that. So Martin Luther uses that. The Gnostics use that very early on against the Jews. It is hard to imagine that Jesus, who preached about love, even about love for an enemy, stated such hurtful things about his own people and culture. However, they were understood and used by Luther and others literally and fundamentally. They were read as blanket condemnations of all the Jews as a collective ethnic group, although they were expressed in the course of a sharp dispute between small groups of Jews. So the biblical exegetes, the typical scholarly view, is that these are arguments between small groups, specific arguments. What they've done is they've made this a collective condemnation and therefore want to have collective punishment, a war crime, against all Jews. So Luther stretched their lines and made them more extreme, more anti-Semitic, and stigmatized and demonized all Jews as liars, as sons of the devil, a bloodthirsty nation, and the killers of innocent prophets and God's messengers. So he paints them in the worst possible light, and he throws the Catholics in there as well. Now, Jesus makes similar statements about some of his opponents, although not about the Jews in general. So although there were serious differences and debates between them, no such hostility dominated the relationship between the historical Jesus and other Jews. Jesus did not hate all Jews. Jesus did not. He was speaking to specific groups of people. Here we see rather the reflection of the mortal tension between the Johannine community. Please give me 1 second. I do need to go for a moment. I'll be right back. And I'm back. Right. So we see the reflection of the mortal tension between the community of John and the Jews who had rejected their claims. Right. So this is from a different view of the Bible. So here you've got hatred, which is being pushed by Martin Luther, versus people saying, look, we need to take a somewhat more nuanced, specific view of what is the conflict happening in the Bible. Are they condemning all Jews, or are they condemning specific people or specific groups? Maloney affirms that the Jews in the fourth gospel never are the Jewish people as such. The term reflects the Christological polemic that led to the breakdown between the community of John and the local synagogue. So there's a local dispute between John and the local synagogue, and of course, those people who hate the Jews are going to go, wow, that applies to all the Jews. So he describes the devil himself as a liar and a murderer and compares the Jews to Satan. Luther offered practical solutions and implementations for the Jewish question, that is, burning all their books, burning their synagogues, their houses, and enslaving the Jews or expelling them from German territories, much like Hitler, much like Mohammed. The harshness and ruthlessness of the language that Luther has used against the Jews and Judaism is unmatched in any Christian culture or in German history until the arrival of Adolf Hitler. The one who is considered a German prophet and the teacher of the German nation has had an immense influence on generations of Christians. Obviously, Luther had no effect. These Germans, the Reformation didn't come from Luther. It was just, no, not at all. Nothing to do with Luther. To cite Plutarch, a word is a deed's shadow. So, actions speak louder than words, but his words incited violent actions. Luther's offensive words against the Jews and Judaism became evil actions of Jew haters during his time, and of course, the Nazis explicitly took Luther's words and applied them. They did not misunderstand them, they applied them correctly. It is impossible to excuse him completely and inevitable to refer to his impact on the German National Socialism and the performance of his anti-Semitic heritage. So, of course, he influenced the Nazis very explicitly. Anti-Semitism was part of the National Socialist Party's policy from the 1920s, and that policy was put into practice, right? And, from 1933 to 1945. Even though the National Socialist Party was a secular movement that was immersed in racial anti-Semitism, it still considered Luther, as Luther considered himself, the prophet of the Germans. They celebrated Luther, right? These people celebrated him. They had ceremonies and events, and they just loved him. So the prophet of the Germans, and used Luther's religious and racist anti-Semitism for its own anti-Jewish propaganda. Luther's anti-Semitic writings played an important role in Nazi propaganda and were a model for Hitler's final solution, the Endlösung. There are clear-cut parallels between Luther's, but not any of the other 16th century reformers' suggestions on how to oppress the Jews and the Nazis' performance of them. Luther's statements were systematically and completely implemented by the Nazis as Luther wrote them. Over much of Europe and North Africa, it's no coincidence that on the anniversary of Luther's birthday, the Nazis initiated their purge of German Jews. So the Kristallnacht, where the Nazis purged the Jews, that was on Luther's birthday. They were celebrating Luther's birthday by implementing this pogrom against the Jews. The so-called Reichskristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, but in fact it was the Reichspogromnacht, or Night of Pogrom. Right. The Nazis destroyed thousands of synagogues, as Luther said they should, Jewish houses, as Luther said they should. They destroyed cemeteries and businesses. They imprisoned and murdered numerous Jews. The choice to burn synagogues and round up the Jews on that anniversary of Luther's birthday was deliberately modeled on Luther's proposals. Right? There is much evidence for a connection between the Reichspogromnacht and Luther's practical anti-Semitic advice. I've already discussed this, I've already gone through this. They implemented Martin Luther's ideas to the letter. 2 weeks afterwards, Martin Sasser, the Lutheran Landesbishop of Thuringia, published a manifesto named Martin Luther über die Juden, Weg mit ihnen. Martin Luther, like remember Deutschland über alles, Germany over everything, Germany above everything. Martin Luther above the Jews. Now he says here Martin Luther regarding the Jews. You can think of this as Martin Luther triumphing over the Jews, away with them, which introduces a summary of the worst statements from Luther's Von den Juden und ihren Lügen with this statement. On the 10th of November, 1938, on Luther's birthday, the synagogues are burning in Germany. At this hour, the voice of the man must be heard, who, as the German prophet of the 16th century, once began as a friend of the Jews due to their ignorance, but who was driven by his conscience, by his Christian conscience, experience, and by reality to become the greatest anti-Semite of his time, the one who warned his people about the Jews. In November 1938, a German official asserted that the wicked Nazis have simply carried out the instructions of Luther. The synagogues have been burned, just as the father of Protestantism required, and that's a simple fact. Yeah, so let me see. Yeah, guys, I do. Yeah, my outburst earlier, I get very upset because I'm dealing with people who are steeped in propaganda, maybe unknowingly, but they are defending murder. At the end of the day, this has led to murder. This has led to atrocities. This hatred has led to vast numbers of deaths, and they are defending it. They're trying to justify it by deflecting, and that bothers me greatly. Now, Heinrich Bornkamm, who served as the war theologian and president of the Evangelical League to the Führer, the Evangelical League, so yeah, the Lutheran. In other words, there's the story of Hitler's Pope, which is untrue. We really should be talking about Hitler's Protestants and Hitler's Lutherans, right? He asked the evangelical Christians for obedience and willingness to make sacrifices, right? So Bornkamm wrote several articles that tie Luther and the German spirit together with one another, right? And he finds a direct line between the state thinking of Luther, Bismarck, and Hitler, because Martin Luther was a totalitarian. He believed in complete obedience to the state. The German people learned their attitudes towards war from Luther, who considered it as an event that itself is divine. Remember, war was good. To kill was good. You would earn reward from Allah. I've discussed this previously with regards to Martin Luther seeing war as good medicine, right? National Socialist ideas prove in their authenticity for us Germans that it extends to the deepest sources of the Reformation. So National Socialist ideas come from the Reformation, according to this good German priest, good German theologian. Luther's attitude towards the Jews were theological, for good or bad, and especially in his later writings, they're all colored with the ethnic, racist characterization of the Jews as a whole. The German Nazis looked to Luther's anti-Semitic legacy and infused it into their own particular racist agenda. So in other words, his ideas paralleled and completely complemented thinking of the Nazis. This was not an accident. This Martin Luther, his words and views literally supported those of the Nazis. So they used it to implement Luther's practical advice and justified it by their own plans to persecute the Jews. The motherland of the Reformation was empty of Jews. Well, Hitler did throw them out, right? And Luther's dream to create Germany and the German society without Jews was fulfilled in Hitler's Third Reich. Luther's sympathetic behavior towards the Jews does not stem from his humanism or moral values. It was an outcome of his religious and political agenda. It was another side of his rebellion against the Roman Church and the Pope. He also hoped to accomplish some economic advantage that could grease the wheels of the Reformation with Jewish financial assistance. Luther's Judeophobia and anti-Semitism cannot be dismissed due to his being weak, old, or ill, or experiencing personal trauma. The comparison of Luther with several of his contemporary reformers and theologians shows that his harsh, anti-Jewish hatred cannot be dismissed as typical of the time. There are essential, unparalleled accusations, brutal advice, violence, and acts that are unique to Martin Luther. There were others who behaved differently, some of them even protected Jews. His awful oppression policy of the church, but also to a harsher and more terrible version. So he became extreme. Luther accentuated and aggravated the well-known church methods even more. His hatred to Judaism and his anti-Jewishness accompanied him almost always during his life. His political agenda to use Jews as scapegoats in order to appease his audience, right, and his aggressive personal character. So when they accused him of being nice to Jews, Luther became violent to Jews because he didn't want to be seen as someone sympathetic to Jews, right? And he also has a very violent personal character. His irrational horror of Jewish mystical power. He was afraid of Jews doing juju on him. So his manifestos had disastrous consequences and are the prehistory of the systematic annihilation of European and North African Jews in the 20th century by the Nazis. As a theologian and reformer of his stature, Luther had other choices. He could have reformed and advanced tolerance and humanism. He preferred genocide. Luther failed to turn a new and constructive historical page. All in all, the Reformation was not a time of progress or religious liberty for Jews, but a time of greater hatred by its founder. And then the final 2 pages. I'm done. Hopefully I have not bored you to death. I know I chased a lot of people away when I had my little outburst, but that guy really annoyed me. I'm sorry. You are aiding and abetting evil. And I cannot tolerate that. You may not like it, but this is the truth. And I'm sorry that I'm not a softly spoken milquetoast fool, but that's going to go, well, maybe you want to reconsider. It's like, no, you are aiding and abetting evil. It's that simple. I'm not going to stand by quietly while you try to deny evil. Sorry about that. Luther considered children. So the last 2 paragraphs here. Martin Luther obviously called for the death of peasants, right? Just like in jihad. He called for the death of Jews. And he also showed this very same. Now people will say, well, Luther only said once, right? Tell me, how many people do you have to kill to become a murderer? Just one. Martin Luther stated bluntly that a deformed boy should be killed because he wasn't human. So you only have to call for one person to be killed to be a murderer, I guess. But of course, everyone wants to go, but it's only one guy, right? No, Martin Luther had a very unholy attitude towards people with disability. He had a crazy superstition. So let's have a quick look at this. Luther considered children with physical or mental handicaps worthless, and he felt that it is better to get rid of them. There was a 12-year-old invalid child in Dessau who assaulted Luther. I don't know if the kid actually assaulted Luther. I haven't seen evidence of that in other talks on this. He described the child as one who eats, shits, and pees, and when he's attacked, he screams. Luther said to the princes of Anhalt, if I were a prince or a lord, I would take this child and throw him into the water, into the Moldau River, which flows near Dessau. He also said, in the original report, it says that I would take a pillow, I would put it over his face and suffocate him. I would basically suffocate him to death. Martin Luther said, suffocate the child to death. Kill him, he's just a devil, he's possessed by the devil, there's no soul in the body, he's not even human, right? That's what Luther said. Then this was later, additionally, apparently this is later evidence that's added. But the princes of Anhalt rejected Martin Luther's suggestion to murder the boy. Right? Now, sie Tischreden, so this is the German Tischreden, vor 8 Jahren war zu Dessau eines blah blah blah. Okay, so that's in the original German sources. And also in the Tischreden, davon wunderbärlichen, seltsamen, ungeheurigen Geburten, so von Weibern bisweilen kommen, disputiert und geredet war, blah. It's all old German, blah blah blah. But basically, in this one, hold on, in this example, let me just translate this. Basically, Luther is talking about, he insults children that are born with deformities and disabilities. He calls them rat mice. He calls them rat mouses, right? So actually, yeah, this is a bit old German, so I'm not going to translate this on the fly very fast because my old German is not that great. But let me just get this translation for you. I thought I had this in the notes, but I do not. So let me just give this a go here. When there was a discussion and talk about the wonderful, strange, monstrous births that sometimes occur in women, Dr. Martin Luther spoke of a woman who gave birth to a child resembling a rat and had run around trying to crawl into a mouse hole under the bench. So, short version here, he would speak in very insulting terms about these people. Now, of course, I've seen many apologists will go, well, look, Martin Luther also said these nice things, which is not untrue. However, Martin Luther stated that people with severe deformities are possessed by Satan. Their souls have been removed, and therefore they are not human. So if he called for the murder of one of them, then you could see that was his general view, because these are not human. So anyone with severe illness, anyone with severe disability was not worthy of life. Life not worthy of life. That was the view of the Nazis. So this ends my discussion. Thank you very much, Harry L. Johnson. Yeah, so the things that I have to say, I can see are offensive to some. They will upset some. I'm not going to make friends by doing this. But I am also very tired of seeing when I'm discussing the facts about Martin Luther, everyone's trying to change the topic to go, oh no, but the popes are diddling kiddies. Oh no, but the Catholic priests are diddling kiddies. It's like, and Martin Luther called for the murder of defenseless children who are handicapped. I guess that's okay. No, we can't talk about that. We got to talk about the Catholics. We can only look at the Catholics because the Protestants are perfect and walk on water, apparently. So, yeah. And of course, there's every effort to deflect. And then the new polemic is, or the new apologetic is, Martin Luther has nothing to do with Protestantism, which is a lie. It's a complete lie. And of course, just as Muslims will lie about Muhammad, now that the facts about Muhammad are coming out, Protestants are lying about Martin Luther. This is the truth about Martin Luther. If I've lied about anything, by all means, please let me know. If I've misquoted something, let me know. But I'm reading this, and I've shown you quotes from Martin Luther, words out of the mouth of Martin Luther. Please tell me those are not factual quotes, and we can go and examine and see if that is actually written in the books of Martin Luther. So, eugenics. Yes, Harry L. Johnson, eugenics. Very good point. Am I really seeing this on the screen? What Luther is, I don't even want to say. Almost makes Muhammad look good. Yes. Useless eaters, they called the sick and infirmed. Yes, and Martin Luther, of course, the Nazis could use this in their polemics because, of course, this was literally what Martin Luther recommended, kill them. And it wasn't unreasonable to extrapolate this idea across all handicapped people. So, yeah. Yeah, for those who were offended by my outburst earlier, that's just how that is. But yeah, you're obviously going to use that as an excuse against me to say that, well, Lloyd is uncouth and Lloyd is this and that. But of course, you're going to overlook the facts that I've presented. And you're going to start lying about show me in the Bible, show me in the Bible. You're not going to go, oh yeah, this is evil. And our Protestant ideology derives from this man. So yeah, guys, I'm pro-Catholic. I notice the Jew haters have Protestant backgrounds. Yeah, look, there's some bad Catholics out there as well. They are very bad Catholics too. Don't get me wrong. I've come across them. So I'm glad Lloyd is stating more facts than anything else and don't talk about news. Yeah. So guys, that's my story. I guess this finishes this up. I've shown you that Martin Luther thought that he was. Let me go back here. Hold on. So I've shown you that Martin Luther thought he was amazing. Martin Luther thought that he was greater than Paul and so on. I showed you some of the stuff, wherever it was, I showed you some of that stuff. But I'll be going through all of this in Martin Luther. There's a lot to cover. I will be going through some of the things I've discussed in isolation. I'll be talking about them in context, along with a great deal of corroborating evidence to show you that I'm not simply taking one quote and trying to stretch it beyond all recognition, that it's actually, there's a pattern, there's consistency. There's a great deal of evidence that corroborates anything I say, because you can find it repeated multiply through Martin Luther's writings and works, and through his colleagues as well. I'm not offended. You let your integrity show again. Well, thank you. But yeah, I get angry. So, okay. So, yeah. So Martin Luther was very, very disparaging towards the early church fathers. He was very insulting towards the Bible. All of these things. Okay. For instance, here's a quote. Behold, what great darkness is in the books of the fathers concerning faith. Behold, what great darkness. In other words, the church fathers were teaching evil. This is why Protestants will also say, history is not important. Show me the Bible. This is why they say, call no man father. These church fathers thought too much of themselves. We will show, and I have showed you already, Martin Luther thought the world of himself. He was greater than any pope. He was greater than any of the church fathers. He even states, if I read this correctly, he was greater than St. Paul. Martin Luther's interpretation was greater than any of the apostles. He writes this. And here he disparages. And of course, so he lays these seeds, he puts these out, and he says, no, the church fathers, they're idiots. The church fathers are clueless. The church fathers are writing darkness. Do you understand? He disparages all Christians who came before him, and only he is correct. So this is Martin Luther. So these ideas that Protestants have come from Martin Luther. And Protestants deny this to my face over and over again, yet they repeat verbatim what Martin Luther was saying, effectively. So, yeah, it's crazy. Behold, what great darkness is in the books of the fathers concerning faith. So, yeah. Can you call them dads? Well, I mean, some translations are teacher. Don't use father, use teacher, instructor. So we shouldn't use those words either. It's like you cherry pick the worst from works like the Dialogue with Trifle, what the Catholic Church taught us. And this was Martin Luther. So guys, I don't know. You tell me if I am exaggerating. You tell me if I am making it up. You tell me if I'm cherry picking. You tell me if I am overlooking the good parts. No, everyone has overlooked the bad parts. We all know the good parts. We've all been force fed the good parts. We have been lied to the bad parts. The good parts, some of those things come very early and then later on he changes his mind, or sometimes the bad outweighs the good. Martin Luther was reckless in his language. He caused harm. He caused murder. He caused genocide. He inspired evil. So yeah, I don't know what else I can say. So let me see. So these are facts. Let me know if I've misinterpreted, misrepresented the facts, but those are them. So I think that's it for me, guys. We've been going for 2 hours now. I can't see what the time is on this because this doesn't show how long I've been going, oddly enough. It's weird. Does OBS show the time? 1 hour 56 minutes. Yeah, it actually does show the time on the bottom right. So guys, we've been going for 1 hour 56 minutes. Wow, thank you very much. So that is Manny Ford. Thank you very much. He says, thank you very much for everything you share here. So guys, what I say here upsets people. What I say is not going to make me friends. Clearly it's going to upset people. I think someone has to speak the truth. These are the facts. This is the truth. Someone has to speak it. Someone has to say it. This is going to turn a lot of people off me because I'm saying uncomfortable things. But yeah, if those people have other facts they would like to bring and they'd like to show me that I'm wrong, that'll be great. But they can say, but Martin Luther said this nice thing. And I can also show, well, Martin Luther also said this evil thing that got 1 million people killed. So Martin Luther said this nice thing. Yeah, Martin Luther also said this evil thing that got 100,000 people murdered. So yeah, which one do we weigh here as more weighty? So yeah. It's just the boy Jay says, thank you, Lloyd, as always, and thank you for being so straightforward and not sugarcoating stuff. Yeah. Kyrie Eleison says, let me just bring it up. Thank you, guys. Let me just... Only Love says, the truth hurts. Before you, Lloyd, I was never aware of how dark and evil Luther was. This channel is eye-opening and needs to blow up for sure. Thank you. Well, I mean, considering the content, the contentious nature, it's going to be very upsetting to most Protestants. I know there are many Protestants and Catholics in my channel, but I hope I'm being honest. I hope I'm providing facts and a reasonable interpretation of those facts. Yeah, Luther. Yeah, Luther said nice things, and Judas was a nice disciple. Yeah. Will there be more Luther videos? Yeah, I'm going to be doing a lot of Luther work. Look, I've got like 200 pages of Luther notes in my PowerPoint. You'll see here, this PowerPoint is currently at 215 pages. You tell me if there's going to be a lot of Luther. So yeah, I got 215 pages of this, and that's besides the other notes that I've got that are not in the slides. So yeah, there's going to be Luther for a couple of months. So guys, should I continue with this? Is this valuable? Is this useful? And is it changing things? Is it actually changing things out there? I know it's upsetting people. I know that Thaddeus has now had 3 of these videos talking about me, and apparently I'm just, he disagrees with my facts. I don't know. So love to see what he disagrees with. So guys, thanks. We should call it a night here. My throat, I'm still sick. Just Janice says, it's uncomfortable. I'd rather hear the truth. Lloyd is my favorite teacher. Thank you. It doesn't make me want to throw myself out to sea instead of Luther. So yeah, guys, look, maybe I could be nicer. Maybe I could be sweeter, but reading this stuff is emotionally draining. It is actually emotionally draining. And sometimes I have to spend hours checking a fact or working through the logic or checking that I'm interpreting correctly. And hopefully that's what I'm doing. Thank you for all your hard work. We need to admit that every religion has the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yes, and that is true. And we need to learn how to discern and work our way through these things. So guys, thank you very much for all of you who are here. And I hope this has been educational. I hope you are able to make good decisions based on good evidence, good information. I've been showing you the quotes from Luther. I selected, after going through dozens of papers, I selected this one as representative of a great deal of truth that synthesizes a great deal of facts about Luther. Luther was evil. Fay says, I never knew Martin Luther was so evil. Yes, he was incredibly evil. I believe he was an evil man. I believe he may have been possessed, or at least influenced or touched by an evil spirit. There was something disgustingly vile about this man. So yeah, guys, yeah, what else to say? I'll be doing a great deal of content. I've got a lot to be talking about. There's many, many topics. I have to go back to nominalism. I want to talk about Islam. I want to talk about a lot of things. Yeah, I'll hate people when they lie to my face and won't give me no explanations, no proof. Yeah, hopefully I provide proof. Hopefully I provide evidence. Hopefully I'm consistent in that fashion. Hopefully I'm providing detailed evidence and references. Now, you don't have my software. You don't have my notes as such, but if push comes to shove, I'll give you my notes, my slides, and you can check them. Right. But yeah, as far as I know, this is reasonably accurate, fairly accurate. It's, well researched. So yeah. Okay, guys. So yeah, let's call it. Are there any last questions? We've gone 2 hours and 43 seconds. Any last questions? Anything that you guys want to ask? Or yeah. So yeah, there's something evil entered the Christian church. Martin Luther was not the first. He was the culmination, and he made it into a theology. Something corrupted Christianity. Luckily, there is still truth inside of these teachings, but it is tainted, and we need to separate the taint from the truth. And Martin Luther his theology was one of hatred. And we need to understand he was deliberately going against old, established interpretation simply because he hated Jews, so he was going to say something opposite. He hated Catholics. He was going to say something opposite, which means he was being opposite out of hatred, not being opposite out of, well, I thought this through. Remember, he says, let my will dominate, not reason, not evidence, because I damn well say so. That was Martin Luther. They have other social media. I am on x.com. It says here, x at Lloyd De Jongh. I'll go there quickly. So if you guys want to follow me there, I annoy people on X as well. I say things that are frustrating and annoying to people. So I've got this stuff here, Luther and the Nuremberg trials, stuff like this. But I post a bunch of things, and yeah, so I do things here as well. So I talk about Islam. I try to talk about the Nazi Mufti of Jerusalem. So follow me on x.com. It's my name, at Lloyd De Jongh. I'll drop this in the chat. You guys can find me there. Anything else? So guys, yeah, it's the more truth you say, the more people who are manifested with demons are going to throw you off. That's what I learned. Yeah. So I'm not an expert. You can still read it, even if you're not. You can still check it out. I post some hopefully interesting things, but mainly I'm on YouTube. I mean, this is the Palestinian Nazi flag, right? The Palestinians were Nazis. They were literally Nazis. You can see it, Palestina. They were Nazis. They were freaking Nazis. Like, the Palestinians were Nazis for sure. I mean, there's no doubt about it. DEI, because you didn't earn it. Yeah, exactly. Little things like this. Jesus was a Muslim. He was also Serapis. He also happened to be Mithras, Attis, and Dionysus. He was Zoroastrian. He was Egyptian. Jesus was Palestinian. He was a Buddhist. He was the son of a Roman soldier. And he also didn't exist. And he was also Gnostic. So, yeah. And, of course, the legacy of Jan Hus, the man who inspired Martin Luther, is Jan Hus, who inspired Mussolini. So yeah, Luther's great role model was this guy who inspired this guy, who was hanging out with this guy. You know what I'm saying? So Martin Luther kept great company. I'll have to rewatch later. Work called out to Mr. Majority. Well, thanks, Artie Fonzie. Great to see you though. Guys, off you go. Have a good night. Okay?